Imagine a drug so powerful that one pill could rewire your brain forever. Not metaphorically, not as an exaggeration, literally. A single pill, taken once, capable of altering the chemical architecture of the human brain in ways that could take years to reverse, if they could be reversed at all. Now, imagine a company that knew this, that had the scientific data, that had the internal reports, that had the field evidence from its own sales representatives, that knew with certainty that its product was doing exactly this to the people who took it. And sold it anyway. In 1996, a small pharmaceutical company introduced a new painkiller to the American market. They called it OxyContin. They told doctors it was safe. They told patients it was not addictive. They told regulators that their slow-release formula made it significantly less likely to be abused than other opioids currently on the market. They told the world they had finally, compassionately, scientifically solved the problem of chronic pain. Every single one of those claims was false, and the people making them knew it. Over the next 2 decades, more than 500,000 Americans would die from opioid overdoses. Not soldiers in a war, not victims of a natural disaster. People who went to their doctor with a bad back, a knee injury, a chronic pain condition, and walked out with a prescription for a drug they had been told was safe. Millions more would lose their jobs, their homes, their families, their futures. Children would grow up without parents. Parents would bury children. Entire communities would be hollowed out completely by the force of a single drug and the choices made by the people who sold it. And the family behind it all collected over $12 billion. They donated to museums, they funded universities, they endowed chairs at medical schools, they put their name on concert halls, on hospital wings, on gallery spaces at some of the most prestigious cultural institutions in the world. They attended charity galas. They were photographed smiling at the openings of exhibitions bearing their family name. While people died in emergency rooms, while children woke up to find their parents unconscious on the kitchen floor, while entire towns lost an entire generation. This is not a story about a drug. This is a story about greed at a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. It's about corruption that reached from small-town doctors' offices to the halls of the United States Congress. About a system that exists specifically to protect the public from exactly this kind of harm, and that failed repeatedly and catastrophically because the people responsible for that failure were paid not to do their jobs. This is the story of Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. And this is buried truth. To understand how one company destroyed a nation, you first need to understand the family behind it. And to understand the family, you need to go back further than most people do. Not to the 1990s when OxyContin was launched, not to the 1980s when the groundwork was laid, but to Brooklyn in 1913. Arthur Sackler was born the son of immigrants who had fled persecution in Eastern Europe, part of the great wave of Jewish immigration to the United States in the early 20th century. His parents settled in Brooklyn, where they built a small grocery business. Life was not comfortable. It was precarious, the way life was precarious for millions of immigrant families in the early 20th century, always one bad season away from genuine hardship. Arthur grew up watching his father work with a kind of desperate intensity, and he absorbed a lesson that would define everything he later did. In America, ambition was not just desirable, it was survival. He excelled in school, he earned his medical degree, he became a practicing psychiatrist working at a hospital in New York, where he conducted research into the biological underpinnings of mental illness, work that was genuinely respected by his scientific peers. He was, by any measure, a gifted physician. But medicine was never going to be enough for Arthur Sackler. The ambition his Brooklyn childhood had installed in him was too large for any single professional lane. In parallel with his medical career, Arthur built a media empire. He purchased a medical newspaper called the Medical Tribune, which he would eventually distribute to over 600,000 doctors worldwide. He purchased art obsessively and at extraordinary scale, eventually donating major collections to the Smithsonian, to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to Harvard, to Oxford. He was a philanthropist, a collector, a publisher, a scientist, a businessman, all at once. But the business that would define his family's legacy was an advertising agency. Arthur purchased a firm called William Douglas McAdams, a medical advertising company. And through that agency, he pioneered something that the medical world had never seen before, and that it has never fully recovered from: the systematic, emotionally sophisticated, scientifically dressed up manipulation of physician prescribing behavior. Before Arthur Sackler, the relationship between pharmaceutical companies and doctors was relatively direct. Companies developed drugs. They published the clinical results in peer-reviewed journals. Doctors read the literature, attended conferences, and made prescribing decisions based on the best available evidence. Arthur changed all of that, and he changed it so thoroughly that the world he helped create became the norm, became invisible, became simply the way things were done. He flooded medical journals with full-page, four-color advertisements that were designed not to inform but to persuade. He created the category of the sponsored medical symposium, the conference paid for by a pharmaceutical company, attended by physicians who were flown to pleasant locations, accommodated in comfortable hotels, fed and entertained, and given presentations carefully designed to build favorable impressions of specific drugs. Most consequentially, Arthur Sackler essentially invented the pharmaceutical sales representative as we know them today. The idea of a company employing a large field force of personable, well-dressed, carefully trained individuals whose full-time job was to visit doctors' offices, build personal relationships over time, remember birthdays and preferences, and in the context of those warm personal relationships, gently and persistently push specific prescriptions. Arthur understood something that medical schools never quite managed to address. Doctors are human beings first. They make decisions the way human beings make decisions, influenced by relationship and trust and reciprocity and social dynamics, not purely by the cold weight of clinical evidence. Arthur built an industry on this insight. He deployed it first on Valium, through relentless promotion to physicians, through campaigns that positioned Valium as the modern, compassionate solution to the anxieties of everyday American life. The drug became a cultural phenomenon. By the 1970s, Valium was the best-selling prescription drug in the United States. It was also, as would become painfully clear over time, significantly addictive. An entire generation of Americans became dependent on a drug that had been sold to them as gentle and safe. The Valium story was, in miniature, a preview of everything that would come later with OxyContin, the strategy of minimizing addiction risk, the cultivation of physician relationships, the transformation of a controlled substance into a mass market product. Arthur Sackler died in April 1987, before OxyContin, before the crisis. But his blueprint survived him perfectly intact. His brothers Mortimer and Raymond had built their own pharmaceutical interests around a company called Purdue Pharma, based in Stamford, Connecticut. After Arthur's death, ownership consolidated further around Raymond's branch of the family. They had identified an opportunity. Oxycodone, a synthetic opioid molecule, had existed since 1917. Powerful, effective, never marketed to the mass market. They developed a new slow-release formulation. They branded it as a safer, more modern alternative to existing painkillers. They prepared to take it to every doctor in America. They would call it OxyContin, and they would build their empire on a single claim, that it was not addictive. To understand why OxyContin spread across America with such devastating speed, you need to understand the specific conditions that existed in American medicine in the mid-1990s. First, there was genuine, widespread concern in the medical community about the undertreatment of pain. A significant movement had emerged among physicians and patient advocates who argued that opioids had been unfairly stigmatized, that millions of Americans suffering from chronic pain were being denied effective treatment. This concern was not fabricated. People in chronic pain were genuinely suffering, and this created the opening that Purdue needed. Second, there was the regulatory environment. The FDA in the mid-1990s was operating under significant pressure to accelerate drug approvals, understaffed and underfunded, pushing toward faster decisions rather than more rigorous scrutiny. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was what would later become known as the 5-sentence letter. In 1980, a physician named Herschel Jick published a brief communication in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was not a study, it was not a clinical trial, it was 5 sentences long, reporting an informal observation that among patients in a hospital setting given opioids for pain, very few appeared to develop addiction. The letter said nothing about patients taking opioids at home without supervision over extended periods. It said nothing about the development of physical dependence. Jick himself, speaking publicly decades later, would express horror at what had been done with his letter. But that 5-sentence letter had been cited by the time OxyContin launched more than 600 times in medical literature as authoritative evidence that opioids were safe. Purdue Pharma's sales representatives walked into doctors' offices across America carrying it like a weapon. In 1995, the FDA approved OxyContin with a label stating the slow-release formula was believed to reduce the potential for abuse. Not proven, not demonstrated through clinical trials, believed. That single word became the foundation of Purdue's entire sales strategy. In conversations with doctors, in printed materials, in training documents for their sales force, they referenced the FDA approval as official validation that OxyContin was safer than other opioids. The implication they drove was a lie. Purdue launched in January 1996 with 671 sales representatives, growing to over 1,000 by the year 2000. Each representative's bonus was calculated based on the number of OxyContin prescriptions written by physicians in their territory. Some were earning $100,000 in bonuses alone, on top of their base salaries. Their message was built around what the company internally called the 1% claim. Fewer than 1% of patients prescribed opioids for legitimate pain would ever develop addiction. It was based on that 5-sentence letter. It bore no relationship to clinical reality. Representatives arrived at doctors' offices bearing gifts, branded merchandise, fishing hats, stuffed animals shaped like pills. They took physicians to expensive dinners. They funded trips to medical conferences at 5-star resorts, where the educational content was minimal and the luxury was the point. They identified the highest prescribing doctors in each territory and directed their most intensive relationship building at keeping those doctors loyal. And with extraordinary precision, they mapped the geography of pain and poverty in America. They targeted post-industrial towns where decades of manual labor had left aging workforces with chronic conditions. coal mining communities where back injuries were endemic, agricultural regions where physical damage was common and specialist care was scarce. These places were not chosen because their residents were weak or susceptible. They were chosen because they were full of people in genuine pain who trusted their doctors absolutely, and whose doctors had been comprehensively deceived. Kermit, West Virginia, population 400 people. Between 2006 and 2016, one pharmacy in the town of Kermit received 9 million opioid pills. 9 million pills for a community of 400 people. That is 22,500 pills for every man, woman, and child in the town. Kermit was not unique. It was an extreme example of a pattern being replicated on varying scales in communities across West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and a dozen other states. It was the opioid machine running at full capacity, exactly as designed. OxyContin was extraordinarily addictive for reasons that Purdue had understood from the beginning and had gone to considerable lengths to conceal. The slow-release formula could be defeated in seconds. Crush the tablet, the coating is destroyed. The entire 12-hour dose of oxycodone floods the brain's opioid receptors at once. This was basic pharmaceutical chemistry. Purdue's own scientists knew it before the drug ever reached a pharmacy shelf. Beyond this, there was the problem of tolerance. The brain adapts. It requires more and more of the drug to produce the same effect. Patients who began on a modest dose found themselves months later needing double, triple, quadruple the original amount. And when they tried to stop, the withdrawal was catastrophic. Sweating so profuse that sheets needed to be changed hourly, vomiting that continued for hours, muscle cramps so severe they felt like bones shattering from the inside. A psychological despair so overwhelming that it drove people to extremes they would never have imagined possible. People who had never sought out drugs in their lives, nurses, teachers, veterans, retired school teachers, people who had taken their medication exactly as prescribed, found themselves physiologically unable to function without a drug they had been told was not addictive. And Purdue knew. In 1997, 12 months after OxyContin's launch, the company's own field reps were filing detailed reports to headquarters. Patients crushing and snorting OxyContin. Pharmacies robbed at gunpoint. A black market forming with alarming speed. Street names already circulating. Purdue's corporate response was a masterpiece of deliberate inaction. Internally, they tracked the reports. They built monitoring systems to identify which areas showed the highest abuse rates. They analyzed the data. They knew precisely where the problem was worst. They used this information to manage their public relations exposure, not to reduce prescribing, not to warn the FDA, not to alert the physicians who were genuinely unaware of the scale of what was happening. Sales representatives were given explicit instructions. Do not raise the subject of abuse with physicians unless the physician raises it first. Maintain the message. The message was that OxyContin was safe. And the revenue numbers climbed with the mechanical certainty of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. $45 million in 1996, $1 billion in 1999, $1.5 billion in 2001, nearly $1.8 billion in 2003, making OxyContin the single best-selling branded narcotic painkiller in the history of American medicine. The Sacklers held weekly revenue calls. They pushed for expanded prescribing. They pushed into elderly patients, cancer patients, and eventually children. In 2001, Purdue obtained FDA approval to market OxyContin to children as young as 11 years old. By the early years of the 21st century, The evidence of catastrophe had accumulated beyond any reasonable denial. Emergency rooms across Appalachian states were operating in sustained crisis. Overdose patients arrived at rates that overwhelmed nursing staff and depleted supplies of naloxone, the drug used to reverse opioid overdoses. County sheriffs reported that prescription drug theft had become the dominant property crime in their jurisdictions. And a phenomenon had spread across multiple states that stood as one of the most damning illustrations of how completely the distribution machine had escaped control: the pill mill. Pill mills were medical clinics operating within the technical framework of legality, run by licensed physicians, able to issue legitimate prescriptions. But their function had nothing to do with medicine. Their function was the industrial production of OxyContin prescriptions for cash. Patients arrived, paid their fee, reported pain, and left with a prescription. In Florida, pill mills spread so rapidly that at the height of the epidemic, there were more licensed pain clinics in the state than McDonald's restaurants. People drove from Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia to Florida specifically to visit these clinics. Law enforcement came to call these routes the OxyContin Express. The DEA had formally identified OxyContin as a major threat as early as 2001, but at every turn, Purdue's legal and lobbying infrastructure created obstacles. Their lawyers challenged enforcement actions, their lobbyists worked congressional contacts, their funded patient advocacy groups organized campaigns arguing that any restriction on OxyContin would harm legitimate pain patients. Congressional hearings were convened in 2001 and again in 2003. Purdue executives testified, programs were announced, materials were distributed, hotlines were funded. None of it made a meaningful difference because none of it was designed to. The legal unraveling began in 2004 with a man named Stephen May. May had been a sales representative for Purdue. He had attended the training sessions. He had received the talking points. He had watched what happened in the territories he served, and he filed a whistleblower lawsuit alleging systematic fraud. Filed under seal, it remained hidden for years, but it set in motion legal processes that began attracting attention from state attorneys general across the country. By 2005, investigators in more than 20 states were conducting parallel inquiries. The evidence was converging toward a single devastating conclusion. Purdue had known from the earliest days of OxyContin's commercial life that the drug was being widely abused. They had accumulated detailed internal documentation of this knowledge. And they had made deliberate choices, repeated choices over many years, to conceal that knowledge from regulators, from physicians, and from the public. In 2007, Purdue Pharma and 3 of its most senior executives pleaded guilty in federal court to charges of misbranding OxyContin with intent to defraud and mislead. The total financial penalty, $634.5 million. For a company that had generated revenues of over $3 billion from OxyContin, it represented roughly 20 cents for every dollar earned. No executive served any prison time. The plea agreement was structured to minimize individual criminal exposure. Purdue paid its fine and continued selling OxyContin. Between 2008 and 2018, while operating under a federal compliance agreement in the wake of its guilty plea, the Sackler family withdrew approximately $10 to $11 billion from Purdue Pharma. The withdrawals were moved into a network of family trusts, limited liability companies, and bank accounts located in multiple countries, including accounts in Switzerland and other jurisdictions selected for their financial privacy laws. Federal investigators would later describe what happened in plain terms. The Sackler family was looting Purdue Pharma, removing assets that would otherwise be available to satisfy victim claims, moving money beyond the reach of American courts, steering the company toward a bankruptcy they intended to use as a legal shield. In 2019, Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey filed a lawsuit that named individual Sackler family members as defendants for the first time, not the company, the people. Internal emails released through the litigation were extraordinary in their candor. Richard Sackler, who had served as Purdue's president during the period of a most aggressive market expansion, had written in a corporate email that the company's response to the growing addiction crisis should focus on attacking those suffering from addiction. He proposed blaming what he called the reckless criminals who were abusing the drug, making the victims the story so the manufacturer could not be. That same year, over 2,600 legal actions were consolidated into a single federal proceeding, the largest pharmaceutical litigation in United States history. In September 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy. Institutions around the world removed the Sackler name from their walls. The Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Oxford University, the Tate Modern. One by one, organizations that had displayed the Sackler name for decades quietly acknowledged that they could no longer do so. In 2021, a settlement was announced, $8 billion in total. The Sackler family contributing $4.5 billion from personal wealth in exchange for broad civil immunity. Victims' families called it a betrayal. Legal scholars questioned whether a bankruptcy court had the constitutional authority to grant immunity to parties who had not themselves filed for bankruptcy. In June 2024, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the bankruptcy plan was illegal, a genuine legal victory. But for families who had buried their children, their parents, their siblings, it felt like justice arriving decades too late. Since 1999, more than 500,000 Americans have died from opioid overdoses. More than all American combat deaths in the Second World War. More than the combined populations of Miami and Minneapolis. At the peak of the crisis, 130 people were dying every single day, more than 5 per hour, around the clock. And the crisis has not ended. When OxyContin became harder to obtain, the millions already physiologically dependent on opioids did not simply stop. They shifted to heroin, then to fentanyl, a synthetic opioid between 50 and 100 times more powerful than morphine, manufactured illegally and smuggled across borders. In 2022, over 73,000 Americans died from synthetic opioid overdoses. The machine Purdue built did not just create an OxyContin crisis. It created a generation of Americans whose dependence outlasted the drug that caused it. When OxyContin was restricted, the addiction found another path. And the path it found was more dangerous and more lethal than anything that came before. The Sackler family today remains one of the wealthiest families in the world. Their fortune, even after the settlements, is estimated at several $billions. Not one member of the Sackler family has ever been charged with a criminal offense related to OxyContin. Not one has spent a single night in jail. 500,000 people, $12 billion, 0 prison sentences. Some truths are buried because they make people uncomfortable. Others are buried because the people who buried them had enough money to hire enough lawyers, fund enough lobbyists, and wait long enough for the world to look somewhere else. This was buried truth. Subscribe for a new investigation every week. The truth is still out there. We are going to find it.